Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution. It is the beginning of a new town hall season. We will soon have a new presidential administration. And that's why it is so important for all of us together to recite the Constitution Center's inspiring congressional mandate. The National Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. And you are about to be treated to a cornucopia of nonpartisan constitutional education and debate. Tomorrow, we launch a thrilling new project, a new webpage called We Love the Constitution. In collaboration with iCivics, the National Constitution Center has invited America's leaders to record videos about what they love in common about the U.S. Constitution, and our leaders have responded. You will find videos from Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Tom Brokaw, Ken Burns, Senators Cory Booker, John Boozman, Susan Collins, Tammy Duckworth, Dianne Feinstein, all talking about their shared love of the U.S. Constitution. They left out a few who? What? Everyone is going to participate. It's going to be great, and you too can do it, because the point of this project is to inspire you to submit your own videos online. It's really easy. Even I can do it. You just take your iPhone, record a 1 minute or 2 minute segment about a part of the Constitution you love and why you love it, and post it online, and it's a unifying, enlightening civic exercise. And then we have this phenomenal series of town hall programs. Next week, Solicitor General Don Verrilli. And then we have a series of thrilling programs for members, and we're trying to really encourage all of you to become members. So who is a member of the National Constitution Center? That's beautiful, almost everyone here. So the 1 or 2 people who are not will be motivated to become members, because you can come to these incredible members-only events, such as, listen to this national symposium on whether we should adopt term limits. The president-elect has endorsed them, and we're going to have U.S. Senator Ben Sasse and Governor Ed Rendell from both sides of the aisle discussing the constitutional dimension of term limits. We're going to have a phenomenal party for the opening of American Spirits, the rise and fall of Prohibition, much more fun than the parties for well, the Jefferson exhibit was slightly more of a downer, but this is it's going to be a really great party. And if you're a member, you can come. And then, as you know, just week after week, this incredible series of podcasts, town halls on the Affordable Care Act, on policing, on the new Supreme Court justice, and so forth. Ladies and gentlemen, okay, you're in for a treat. We've got America's greatest journalists and thinkers with really a diverse perspective about to discuss the most urgent public policy question of our time, which is what's going to happen over the next 100 days. And the goal of the program is to be descriptive, to educate all of us, because there's going to be a lot of policy stuff happening, and we're going to run through the various topics that are in the president-elect's proposed plan, understand what he's likely to propose, how Congress and the courts might or might not push back, what the constitutional constraints might be, and by the end, with this balanced, rigorous, wonky, meaty discussion, we're going to know more about the constitutional future of our republic than we did before. And in order to help us do this, we have this incredible group. So, ladies and gentlemen, I guess let me introduce them, and then I'm going to do my come on down, because they're such an amazing group. We have Benjamin Domenech, who's the publisher of The Federalist, host of the Federalist Radio Hour, and he writes The Transom. Paul Gottfried is Raffensperger Professor of Humanities Emeritus at Elizabethtown College, the author of 13 books, including a study of the perpetually shifting conservative movement making sense of the American right. Carol Lee, the White House correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Ryan Lizza, the Washington correspondent for the New Yorker, my old friend and New Republic colleague, who I'm so thrilled to welcome back. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Benjamin Domenech, Paul Gottfried, Carol Lee, and Ryan Lizza. No, I wasn't kidding. There we go.
I feel like I can do a Price is Right walk.
Exactly. It is.
All right.
Absolutely. It is like a Price is Right walk, but we have so much to run through and so much to learn together. Let's jump right in. Ryan, a central agenda item of the president-elect and the Republican Congress is the repeal of Obamacare. Tell us how that's likely to proceed and what some of the twists and turns might be.
Easy question.
Yes, let's jump right in.
Oh my God. Imagine if you were sitting here and someone asked you in 2009, tell us how Obamacare is going to be passed and what the twists and turns are. You would have to predict, 8 years of twists and turns. I think what's happening right now in Washington is the easy part, which is the 6-year campaign against Obamacare from Republicans and the promise of repeal and replace is smashing into the reality of how Washington works and how Obamacare in the last 6 years has become embedded into the lives of some 20 million people who have health insurance, a lot of states who have taken massive amounts of new funding in Medicaid, and you're starting to see the practical effects of that. And the Washington piece of this is the tension, two things. One is the tension, the obvious tension, and probably this is going to come up on many of the issues we discussed tonight, between President-elect Trump, who is not known for digging into the details of policy. Healthcare, Carol and I probably agree with this. Healthcare policy is really complicated stuff. You have to know a lot to understand it. And Trump has never really exhibited a great grasp for the details. He said something the other day that has made the life of a lot of his Republican colleagues in Congress much more difficult. He said he's going to have a plan that will have health care for everybody. Now, we've never had a plan in this country that has health care for everybody. That's one of the issues that Obama tried to solve, and he didn't get there, obviously. So I think you're going to see increasing skepticism on the part of some Republicans about repealing, which is the easy part, right? You can repeal anything, no problem, and they can do that without with a simple majority. Until you see an actual plan that goes through the normal congressional process, through the committee process, that is debated and, as they say in Washington, scored by the Congressional Budget Office, until you have something that is solid and that we can actually look at and say, okay, here's the number of people that are going to lose health insurance, but here's why this is better than Obamacare. Until you get to that point, I don't think you're going to have replace, because replace requires 60 votes and Republicans have 52 votes in the Senate. People like Susan Collins, who said today she's not on board with replace unless you have a plan. So I think what you will see is, as the reality of writing a replacement sets in and as the legislation becomes crystallized, this debate is going to get very, very messy. One of the things Obama learned in 2009 is get your agenda fast as possible, otherwise, because what happens is the opposition and the blowback whips up as time goes on. And so that's why they want to do it. They want to do it fast. But you'll see more and more people, Republicans like Collins, saying, "Slow down. I need to see the details first."
That's great. But I mean, talk about that. And Ryan is suggesting that some conservatives and libertarians may be disappointed that the purity of the promise to repeal will be thwarted by moderates in politics. What is your response?
Well, again, to Ryan's point, he's correct when he says that repeal is the easy part. I mean, they've repealed it before. It's gotten to Obama's desk before. He's vetoed that repeal. They can obviously do the same now. The difference is the challenge of the replace. One of the things that you have is, whenever anything is around for a certain amount of time, is stakeholders, people who adjusted their businesses, their decisions, the economies of states to this new reality. And you see that not just within the insurance market, but particularly within invested hospital systems, which are often the largest employers in many of these states. That's a significant challenge for a lot of the politicians who are going to have to deal with the reality of basically systems that have adjusted for what they thought things were going to be, in many cases undergone a condensing of their affairs or even merged with other systems in order to adapt to Obamacare, who are now concerned about a system that they are not familiar with that would involve a lot of change. One thing, though, that I think is significant is that you've seen a unification of kind of some of the I wouldn't say extreme, but some of the more ambitious elements of people who want to have a significant reform away from what Obamacare represents, wedding themselves with Trump, including people who were strong critics of Trump, like Rand Paul, who has been out there sounding the same message over the past couple of weeks, as opposed to maybe the people who were more moderate and saying, well, we'll have a waiting period, we'll have several years for markets to adjust or something like that. It seems clear to me that Donald Trump's approach on this is going to be, as it is in so many other areas, just putting his foot on the gas pedal and just saying, who cares where we're going there fast. I think that same thing, that same principle is going to apply here. The challenges, of course, are that beyond just the investment of political players, you have the investment of states. The point that Ryan made around Medicaid expansion is a significant one. Mike Pence attempted to make something work with a Medicaid waiver in his own state of Indiana. I think it's significant that the two people who have been named to strong health positions in the Trump administration to this point, Tom Price to HHS and Seema Verma to CMS, are both people who were close to close to Pence in Congress when he was there. Verma was a former Mitch Daniels acolyte who really worked a lot on the Healthy Indiana plan. You may end up with a situation where what Republicans end up with accepts some form of the Medicaid expansion as permanent and then works mostly on the private insurance market where Obamacare, frankly, is less popular. It does the subsidy systems, the exchange is less popular than some of the Medicaid populations that would lead to a lot of disruption for state budgets.
Thanks for that. Carol, Ben mentioned that there may be conflict between President Trump putting his foot on the accelerator and some pushback from Congress. Who is likely to drive both the repeal of Obamacare and the other regulatory repeals of the administration? Will it be the president or Congress, and might we see some conflict between the two?
Well, we've already seen a little bit of conflict between the two. If you look at you had Republican leaders in Congress saying that they wanted to repeal and replace later, and Donald Trump weighed in, I believe, with a tweet, and they had to change their minds, and things were shifting around. So they've already clashed a little bit on that. I think the question is, Donald Trump said in an interview this week with the Washington Post that he has a plan and it's almost ready. And as these guys mentioned before, it's, insurance for everybody. Well, there's a lot of questions that come with that. Is it could have insurance for everybody, or it would, because that's the difference between a big budget and not so much. And if he cares about the Congressional Budget Office, then that matters. So I think that there will be various ways in which, as they go wrestle over the different policies, that the Republicans and the incoming president will clash. The other thing that's going to happen is Democrats have been getting an earful from the White House and President Obama. For anyone who's paid close attention to him, he doesn't spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill, and he made a point to go there and talk to Democrats and say, don't help them with this. And so there'll be resistance there. And as I think Ryan mentioned earlier, eventually Donald Trump is going to need some Democrats for the replace part. But this is a very tricky, I covered the 2009 healthcare fight. There was, obviously they were starting from nothing and creating something, and that was a big battle. And this to take something that's already embedded in the system and try to pull it out by the roots and redo it, and is very complicated. And one of the things that the White House has been banking on, and you've seen the president do this in his second term in particular, is really try to embed that law even more so than it has been. So that is really difficult and tricky to undo.
Fascinating. Paul, Carol raises this question whether repeal is easier than replace, and I want you to address the broader efforts to repeal the regulatory state. So, ladies and gentlemen, we had this incredible symposium last week, which some of you saw the public portions of, where these federal judges from across America came to discuss the future of the regulatory state and what can President Trump repeal by executive order, what does Congress have to do, and how judges might push back. You were there during the Reagan administration and saw I think what you've characterized as a more centrist president not really succeed in uprooting the regulatory state. How successful will President Trump be? What will the bureaucratic pushback be? And a year later, might we see a significantly reduced regulatory state?
Yeah, I think first one has to begin by contrasting the two presidents. I think, as Ben observed before, that the Reagan in 1964, who spoke on behalf of Barry Goldwater, was not the Reagan who became governor of California and was sort of a centrist governor, although academics began to shriek in desperation and leave the state. He did not really make his mark as a particularly right-wing governor. And as president, he did very little to change the regulatory state, and the Department of Education, for which I was appointed as an advisor, actually grew under President Reagan. And I think Republicans were just happy to have Reagan in the White House, and he was celebrated by Heritage and by other Washington conservative fixtures. But I don't think he changed very much. His presidency had minimal impact on the nature, on the character and the extent of the regulatory state. I think what you see with Trump is something a very different kind of figure. He doesn't speak about repealing the regulatory state, or he doesn't use terms like, I'm going to get the government off your back, which Republicans don't do, in fact. They usually increase the size of government, which many of their constituents expect them to do, even while using these banalities about getting government off your back. But I think in the case of Trump, somebody says he's going to drain the swamp in Washington, and he promised to reduce the federal bureaucracy by 20%. That is going to be very, very difficult, and he might, he might in reality reduce it by much, much less if he sees reducing it at all. On the other hand, he is very much of a representative of the working class. He's going to renegotiate treaties or trade agreements to help the working class. He is going to do all kinds of things to make their lives easier. Things that I think would assume the existence of a large state. But at the same time, he also promises to reduce the size of the regulatory state. I think sort of getting back to this question of, is it easier to repeal than replace them? Obviously, I can't say that it is easier. I think there will be Democrats who are going to hold the line. The Republicans who might come over to the repeal position, the Democrats would be the lady senator from North Dakota, possibly Joe Manchin from West Virginia. I don't see where he's going to get any more votes from the Democratic Party. And some of the Republican support looks shaky. I think someone mentioned Susan Collins from Maine. There are probably other shaky votes there. So I think there's going to be a problem repealing unless there is some other program which is already in place, which there is assurance, which he gives there's some assurance that will be voted in together with the repeal. And there are of course alternatives that have been proposed. One by Tom Price from Georgia, who will now be the head of Health and Human Services. Paul Ryan has a plan, and I think the two of them overlap. But there has to be something in place, I would suggest, in order for the repeal to go through. And whatever is in place will have to be sufficiently appealing so that he'll get the requisite number of votes in order to repeal.
That is a fascinating historical reminder that repeal is easier than replace, that Republicans have promised but failed to reduce the size of government, and that much will depend on laws passed by Congress. So some of the laws that came up in our judicial seminar include the REINS Act, regulation from the executive in need of scrutiny, which would require all major rulemakings to go through Congress before taking effect, and something called Chevron deference. Okay, homework time, ladies and gentlemen, from law class. Mm-hmm. Lawyers remember from law school, there's something called a Chevron case that requires courts, when they confront a regulation passed by the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, to defer to the judgment of the administrators on the grounds that the administrators have expertise. And our great visiting scholar, Senator Mike Lee, has proposed a bill in Congress that would end Chevron deference and allow judges to take a hard look at regulations. The shoe may be on the other foot now that the regulators are from the Trump White House. So the question of how courts are going to interact with these new regulations is going to be crucial. Okay, Ryan, there's so much on the table in President-elect Trump's 100-day program, including major tax reform, immigration reform, withdrawing from NAFTA, withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement. What is next on the agenda, on the assumption that you can only get a couple things passed fast? In addition to Obamacare, what do you think will be at the top of the agenda and what's going to happen?
Well, so since this is the Constitution Center, I think the most important thing to point out and this is the first lesson that every president learns when they get to Washington, is one, that Congress is a co-equal branch of government, and that the powers of the presidency are not nearly as strong, especially when it comes to the legislative process, as our popular assumptions about the power of the presidency are, right? In the press and in popular culture, the presidency is this enormously powerful position. Of course, the Constitution says otherwise. So that's the first lesson they learn. Obama still talks about that. And then the second lesson is that there's this thing in the Senate called the filibuster, and the Republicans have 52 votes in the Senate, and that's not enough to pass his agenda. If anyone in this room can tell me what a health care plan that gets 60 votes in the Senate looks like, I would be very interested to hear it. If you can tell me what an immigration plan in the Senate looks like that gets 60 votes, you would win an award. Tax reform can be a little bit different theoretically because you have so many moving pieces with tax reform. You can, if Trump wants to be the deal maker, you really can, you could have a sort of like a 1998 style deal, the way that Clinton and the Republican Congress did, where Democrats and Republicans essentially traded major priorities to get to that supermajority. But that is the thing to watch in Washington, is the Senate, 60 votes. I think at some point Trump is going, when he understands this, I would not be surprised if he leads a crusade against the filibuster. And remember, a lot of Democrats, when Barack Obama was president, especially the younger Democrats in the Senate who are now silent on this, as you can imagine, they wanted to get rid of this filibuster. And it does seem like Schumer and McConnell have always opposed that. But at some point, Trump is going to realize that his agenda just can't get anywhere because there's no bipartisan, the Venn diagram on these issues, it's not there. And that's why nothing has happened in Washington all these years. So the fact that Republicans control all the institutions of government is slightly overrated or exaggerated when they don't have 60 votes in the Senate. So I think that is, I didn't really answer your question, but I just think that is the dynamic on all of these issues.
Well, that's a huge constitutional point. It's obviously a basic one, but really important, and Ryan has covered all these administrations, that the president cannot act alone. And Congress has so many more enumerated powers than the president, which is why Madison thought Congress, not the president, would be the most dangerous branch, and why William Howard Taft, my constitutional hero, the subject of my next biography, felt that he could make recommendations to Congress, but he would send these 300-word missives and then just sit back and wait for Congress to act because he thought the president had no authority to lobby or cajole. It was up to Congress to pass.
19th century version of tweets.
It was a 19th century version of tweets. Except they were
twice as long.
Lugubrious, twice as long, and very legalistic, but beautiful. He was such a...
Two-threaded tweets.
And there was waiting.
And there was what?
Waiting.
You had to wait.
You had to wait.
Which then you could think twice, which was often a good thing. That's right. But Taft was a hero, the underappreciated constitutional president. You'll be hearing much, much more about him.
Yeah,
but let me just ask Ben about, well, there are two questions on the table, the filibuster and taxes. Mm-hmm. And Ben, could you imagine, so if the Democrats filibustered a Supreme Court nominee, presumably the Republicans would blow up the filibuster for the Supreme Court. If they filibustered a health care reform act, would the Republicans blow up the filibuster for the health care?
I think Ryan raises an interesting point when it comes to the legislative filibuster and whether Donald Trump would encourage Republicans in the Senate to get rid of it in order to advance his own policies. I think certainly the filibuster is going away when it comes to judicial appointments that we've already crossed that bridge. President Obama himself, filibustered a Supreme Court nominee when it came to his tenure in the Senate. I think that there's just no way, and that, by the way, is a much younger tradition when it comes to comparing things. But I want to go back to the point about Congress and its relationship with the executive. Obviously, Congress was supposed to be the first. It is the Article I, branch. But the problem is that over the course of decades, really almost a century now, Congress has been gradually ceding more and more of their own given powers to the executive, both by inaction, unwillingness to use these powers, and in their own political self-interest. So here's the situation that you have. You are a member of Congress. If you make a decision about a particular rule, in committee or vote for it on the floor, you are responsible for that rule. You have to answer to your constituents for it. You particularly have to answer for it when it gets in their way or does something that you didn't really intend for it to do that makes their lives troublesome. Instead, if you have the approach of saying, rather than write this rule myself, I will cede my power to top men, to the thinkers who make up the executive branches of various elements of the administrative state to make determinations themselves, to form rules out of their experience, then what I have the ability to do as a member of Congress is to say, well, you know, I gave the Department of Health and Human Services the authority, as they did under Obamacare, to do all of these various things. But I didn't actually intend them to do this thing that is particularly troubling to you. I will hold a hearing about it, and I will write an angry letter. And then you can be happy, and I can be happy, and I'm not responsible for the decision that happened here, and I've already expressed and represented you by complaining about it. At the end of the day, the Congress today has far more limited powers than the founders actually intended it to have. You really have a situation where all you've really got are government shutdowns, filibusters, and impeachment, okay? Not just of the president, but of various officials. These are powers that Republicans, when President Obama were in charge, were very loath to use. They had to be cajoled into using them by members of their base or by fellow members of the body. Now we'll have an opportunity to see what Democrats do when they are in this position of permanent opposition, of whether they're going to line up en masse and go once more into the breach to fight every single thing that Donald Trump and his administration wants to get done at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. I'm not sure what that really looks like, because from my perspective, Trump likes nothing more than to tell you he's made the greatest deal. And the question is just on which of these things he wants to cut those deals or is willing to cut those deals, is willing to engage in horse trading with Democrats in order to cajole them in one direction. The thing that obviously gives him an opportunity to do that in the short term is simply the fact that so many Democratic senators who are from states that Donald Trump won are up for re-election 2 years from now.
So this is really interesting. I'm hearing both of you say that progressives and Democrats, having celebrated the imperial presidency and scorned checks by Congress for centuries, are suddenly rediscovering the virtues of that, but in practice their ability to exercise it is limited because of the enfeebled filibuster and the idea that impeachment is not an option when you don't hold the Congress. Carol, if there is to be an area where a deal is to be made, both Ryan and Ben are suggesting maybe it's tax reform. And I want you to walk us through what the tax bill might look like. On the table are tax reduction for the middle class of 35%, the number of brackets reduced. Most specifically, let's just get down to brass tacks. Is this alarming proposal to eliminate the charitable deduction for contributions over $500,000 actually going to pass? Which would be very bad news for the National Constitution Center. You know,
this reminds me of when the president proposed changing 529 plans. It's a whole.
It's a firestorm. So what's going to happen? Could we have a deal?
I think that in that space is probably the best bet for Donald Trump to get that coalition of if you're talking about tax cuts for the middle class and other types of tax reform that would benefit particularly the middle class, it's going to be really hard for Democrats not to engage on that. Also, you know, one of the things that President Obama thought he could do when Paul Ryan became Speaker was tax reform. So there's a lot of groundwork that's been laid over this. I covered the 2011 budget fights and the debt limit battle, and you know, all the paperwork is there, all the policies are there. There's some new things floating around, but there's certainly a lot of potential to get something done on those issues, and more so than some of the other things that have been put on the table by the president-elect.
Any sense, Paul, about what exactly the final tax package might look like?
I think you've asked the wrong person. I'm not a policy wonk.
Then let me go back to Carol and ask.
Let Carol answer.
What could it?
Well, I think
no one knows, of course, but
no one really knows. But it'll be, you know, there's different types. I mean, the president wanted to do corporate tax reform, and the Republic, you know, it'll be, you know, if they can do both, I think that would be the ultimate goal. I don't know exactly what it would look like. I'm not steeped in the policy details of what Donald Trump is thinking in terms of tax reforms, but there's a number of ways to get at a very comprehensive package, and I think that that's one of the things that would be likely to gain momentum in the first few months of administration.
That sounds right. We don't know what it'll look like, but that seems to be the area. But Paul, perhaps this is an issue for you because you have this great historical perspective about failed Republican efforts to reduce the size of government. We have competing priorities, obviously, to strongly reduce taxes, but also to vastly increase infrastructure spending. How are they going to be reconciled? And is the deficit going to be smaller or bigger at the end of the first 100 days?
Yeah, I really find it just inconceivable that the deficit is somehow going to shrink if the government embarks on this infrastructure program. It's simply, I just don't know how this is going to happen. And the shrinking the government, the federal government by 20%, I think is extremely problematic. And if he thinks he's going to save money that way, he is really going to have a battle on his hands before he gets anywhere. But there's another point I want to get back to, which is why legislative bodies keep losing their power or surrender power to the executive. And I think if we go back to the 18th century, when Madison said that the Congress will be the most dangerous branch of government, he was making a common 18th century assumption that in a Republican form of government, the legislature is dominant. And if you have any kind of tyranny, it'll be a legislative tyranny. You read someone like Rousseau or others who are writing in this period, they're talking about, almost the absolute power being vested in a legislature. The executive power was associated with monarchy, not with Republican forms of government, and we were to have a republic, not a monarchy. However, in the course of the next 2 centuries, as the government becomes more democratic and more responsive to the popular will, what happens is people are going to ask for social programs, public administration comes into existence, which, whether it's placed under Congress or the president, gains enormous amount of power, very often sort of extra constitutional powers, it's been argued. And the president supposedly can do things in a hurry, and very often does. He can use executive orders. Congress, I think, as Ben pointed out, is in some cases very happy to surrender power if it is being called on to do something which is controversial and which can lose congressman votes back home. So for all of these reasons, legislatures have lost power, not only in the United States. If you look at the government of France, for example, you have a legislative government after the Second World War. But then you have a new republic, a fifth republic, which is established by de Gaulle, which is the presidential government. The government of post-war Germany, as it was conceived by the German and American architects, was to be basically a legislative form of government. Today, the chancellor has an incredible amount of power, reserve power, and that power continues to grow. And one might say that the more effective democratic republics or liberal democracies have developed very strong executives. I mean, it's not something that pleases me particularly, sort of as an old-fashioned constitutionalist, but I think that this is an historic trend that may be irresistible at this point. And the United States is only one of a number of countries in which this development has occurred.
Beautiful. Don't you see how this great policy discussion is developing a constitutional dimension, thanks to Paul's superb perspective? And Ryan, I'm going to be a Taft bore here, but I think it frames two of the debates. So the election of 1912, two positions on presidential power. Taft says the president can only do what the Constitution explicitly allows. Roosevelt, the populist, claiming the stewardship theory of the presidency, says the president can do anything the Constitution doesn't explicitly forbid. Progressives embrace that imperial presidency, so do Republicans. All of a sudden, it's Trump, and progressives are thinking, as Paul suggested, my God, have we gone too far? Is it possible for Congress to reassert itself? And broadly, I'm interested in the question, and in particular, the question of tariffs, which was the big question in Taft's day. Congress is reducing tariffs and actually does under Taft's leadership. Trump has promised to slap tariffs on China and Mexico. The Constitution gives Congress the right to impose tariffs, but there's a Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, which allows the president to restrict trade during times of war, and basically is this huge delegation to the president to do tariffs on his own. So the question is, might either progressive or constitutionalist conservative critics of the imperial populist presidency be successful, and what about tariffs?
Yeah, it's interesting. The parties have essentially flipped on their views of Congress and the presidency, right? During the sort of reign of when the White House, when Republicans seemed to have a natural advantage in the White House, that sort of peaked in the Reagan and Bush years, and the Democrats seemed to have a natural advantage in Congress when they controlled the House for, I guess, 40 years until 1994. The view advanced by a lot of Republicans in the 70s and 80s was one of a ultra-empowered presidency, especially when it comes to foreign affairs. You'll remember Vice President Cheney bringing this view very strongly into the Oval Office. A lot of the legal folks that went into the White House brought this view. And as things flipped, as Congress became the home to Republicans, as it seemed now that Republicans had a natural electoral advantage in Congress, a lock on the House of Representatives, and Democrats, at least for a short time there, seemed to have a natural advantage on the White House. The party's view on these, on the relative importance of one branch versus the other flipped. You do now have, as Ben is very familiar with, you have a lot of libertarian-oriented Republicans in the House and a couple in the Senate who seem to be truly ideological about this and not just situational. Some of the folks in the Freedom Caucus, a few of them, like Raul Labrador comes to mind. People who, the first thing when you sit down with them, they remind you that the Congress was put in Article 1 for a reason. So, and they have, some of them have already made noises about reining in the executive. Look at Rand Paul, for instance. He said he would not support John Bolton for Secretary of State if Trump went forward with Bolton when he was in the mix, because his views on he thought Bolton's views on foreign policy were far too interventionist. And you'll have a lot of Democrats, because they're terrified of Trump and the fact that he's going to be president and will have any power at all, arguing for the most restrained executive branch possible. So you could see some natural coalitions there. But yeah, in terms of policy, I think a lot of Republicans are simply interested in advancing the pre-existing conservative agenda that was around before Trump ever came on the scene. And if that means ceding a little bit more power to Trump to do that, then I think they'll be okay with that.
Great, Ben, give us more specific examples of libertarian and civil libertarian constitutionalist alliances against Trump. Might it be over tariffs or NAFTA, which in theory Trump can withdraw from unilaterally but might be opposed? How might it play out?
I think it's going to be fascinating to see this play out because there seems to be a strong recognition for the first time among progressives that as it relates to domestic policy, the executive has become too powerful. Under George W. Bush, you heard a lot of progressives say, what the executive is doing when it comes to security or privacy issues or any of these other kind of war on terror related issues, that the executive had become too powerful. But now that's spread beyond that. It's spread toward domestic policy as well, which is the first time that I'm hearing progressives express views that perhaps, maybe not all government should be in Washington. Maybe, states and localities can govern themselves, which is a really interesting idea, and one that I am, as the publisher of The Federalist, quite a fan of. So
this happened during the Bush years too. Suddenly federalism became cool among Democrats. We used to write about that.
Yes. And so, hey, I think locally grown everything is wonderful, including government. So from my perspective, that possibility of a left-right rediscovery of the 10th Amendment and that kind of thing is something that I think could be very healthy and interesting. But I actually think the flashpoints are less likely to be issues of trade than where I actually think that Trump, I won't say that he can be moved, but symbolism is more important to him than what the actual policy is, in my estimation. But when it comes to issues of civil liberty, that's where you'll really be able to see the clashes happen, because the Raul Labradors of the world, the Mike Lees of the world, the Rand Pauls of the world, the Ben Sasses of the world, they are not going to put up with what they view as being unconstitutional encroachments on Bill of Rights liberties and the kinds of things that they view as being essential to their ideology. And that is a clash that I think they're already preparing for. The kind of thing that you're going to see work out, frankly, to me, looks like this. You'll see people who want to push the envelope on an issue like healthcare, like Rand Paul, stand up next to Trump and agree with him. We need to do this now. We need to do it right. You know, we have to deliver this in this certain way. And then I think they will break with him when they feel that he is doing something that is authoritarian, that is compromising people's liberty, that is invasive, or that is violating their rights in some way that they believe goes against their constitutionally held rights. That's going to be a very interesting thing to see play out. What's the first thing that happens along those lines? I'm not sure. I couldn't really predict today where that clash comes, but it is going to come, and I think probably sooner rather than later. And the way that Trump reacts to it is going to be very interesting. Does he just tweet angry memes at this person all day? You know, I mean, I've said this before, but my favorite moment going forward, the one that I cannot wait to see happen, is what happens the first time that a Republican shuts down government on Donald Trump, which will happen. This will happen at some point. Someone will try to do that, okay? And when that happens, how does he react? Does he try to make a deal? Does he just yell at the person? It'll be interesting to see.
That's great. Carol, can you play that out and imagine what the first conflict might be between Republicans and Trump and how he might react?
Well, you've seen a number of things already, and not that they've provoked very emotional reactions from Donald Trump, but one of his plans is to instill term limits in Congress. And I think Mitch McConnell's quote was, "Yeah, no, that's not coming up for a vote in the Senate." Yeah. And just like that, and you'll see a number of things that will happen like that. So it's kind of hard to know. I do think that to go to what we were talking about earlier, one of the ways in which Congress has really decided to take a step back and not engage has been on issues of military force, and that has been. It seems like it's still just a residual reaction to what happened during the Iraq War vote. But a number of times, this President Obama has tried to get Congress to, whether it's authorize an authorization for the use of military force for the fight against Islamic State, because they're basing their legal and their justification on the one from 2001, or it's for Syria when he was considering launching airstrikes on Syria. And so, there's a lot of domestic policies that'll be swirling around in the first 100 days of this Trump administration, but there's a lot of foreign policy that's going to be happening too. And it'll be interesting to see how this Congress engages with this president, and also how this president engages with this Congress, because one of the things that lawmakers have been able to do in not taking those votes is they can just blame the White House, and that's a two-way street. Obviously, there are things that the president doesn't really push for because he just wants to use it as a political bludgeon on and blame Congress. But you'll have issues like North Korea and Syria, and the president's-elect they're already clashing over Russia. There's investigations into the hacking report and what happened during the 2016 election, and Donald Trump, obviously, as everyone knows, has not really come around to what is in those reports, although he says he does think that it was Russia. So I don't know, I guess is the simple answer, but there's a number of ways in which those clashes could take place.
Nicely put. Well, Paul, give us your constitutional perspective. Historically, on foreign policy, as Carol suggests, Democrats have tended to rally around Republican presidents who've been interventionists but have resisted them on domestic policy using ideas like the new federalism, which, as both Ryan and Ben said, was resurrected during the Bush administration by progressives and is now being resurrected by progressives today. Is the same pattern going to happen? Or, because there's so much constitutional talk in the air, could we imagine a new constitutional constraint against Trump by constitutionally minded liberals and Republicans that we haven't seen before?
I'm skeptical. I know that they're going to say that Trump is going to push too hard, and both are going to push back. My experience, in fact, this is sort of Gottfried's law, that any alliance between right and left against overbearing or overweening power in the center, or center right, or center left only exists for about 2 minutes, and then it just falls apart. And I'm thinking of the period during the Iraqi invasion, and when the left opposed this, because basically they were out of power. When they came back into power, they sort of lost their revulsion for war or for meddling overseas. But when they were out of power, many of them opposed the invasion of Iraq. Well, there were a lot of people on the right who went unreported who opposed the war in Iraq. I was one of them. And nobody noticed me, and nobody noticed, maybe they noticed Rand Paul or Ron Paul or a few other people who were famous, but there was a groundswell of opposition on the right. But the Democratic position was the Republicans are the war party, they're interventionist, and they want to convert everybody to American way of life and so forth. So the fact that some kind of alliance could have been made between right and left in opposing the war just sort of went by the boards. The same thing, by the way, was true during the Vietnam War, that there were people on the right who opposed the war, but their opposition was not very much played up. The question is, can you really put Rand Paul and Chuck Schumer together for very long? Are they going to cooperate in holding back Donald Trump? And on the foreign policy issue, it has become almost hypocritical for the left to say we are non-interventionist and we're anti-war unless you're somebody like Bernie Sanders, who has consistently voted in a certain way or taken certain positions. But obviously the United States was knee-deep in the Obama administration in 2014 in the Ukrainian confrontation with Putin. It has taken pro-war positions in other situations. It has simply not pulled back. I mean, the Republican criticism, which may be correct, is that they make gestures and they don't go ahead, as what happened with the drawing the red line or the line in the sand, or whatever in Syria. This is true, but Democratic administrations do not show a great aversion to war. Even modern liberal Democratic administrations, they did get involved in Libya, in what I think was probably a stupid involvement. But now for the left to claim we are the party of peace, we don't want to get involved in wars. I mean, this by now rings hollow. Other possibilities for an alliance might be to sort of hold back Trump if he seems to exceed his power or pushes too far on something that Congress opposes. Perhaps like closing, they'll close down Congress or something to oppose him. This would be a kind of gesture. It might go on for a few days, and then it would end. But I really don't see any long-term alliance of right and left, except to deal with the certain critical issues that may arise within a short period of time, and then will pass. So I'm very skeptical about how long this kind of alliance can last. As I said, I really can't see Rand Paul and Chuck Schumer, operating together for very long, and agreeing on very much.
Superb. Okay, this is an amazing group of questions you've submitted, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for writing them. With the aid of my constitutional reading glasses, I've put them in piles, and there are a couple of themes, and this is sort of a lightning round, and let's get through as many of them as possible. And the first two have to do with the Supreme Court. Who do you anticipate Trump will nominate for the court? How will the Senate react, particularly Senate Democrats? If the Senate does not invite consent, at what point is it not carrying out its constitutional responsibility? And can Republicans get to 60 seats in the Senate in 2 years? Ryan, the president-elect,
Good questions.
Promised to nominate soon. Who's it going to be? Tell us. You're supposed to know this.
I think a lot of senators hope it'll be Ted Cruz so they can get him out of the Senate. But and Cruz seems to be, publicly his disposition towards Trump has changed quite a bit. So I think he's hoping. I agree with what Ben said before. Is the obvious path of the first nominee is going to be a Democratic filibuster, because it's really hard to see who Trump could pick that Democrats come around on. things are just so polarized, especially on something like that. And there's very ill will right now among Democrats for what McConnell did, essentially stealing the Supreme Court seat away from Barack Obama. And I think there's a very high chance that the so-called nuclear option will be triggered, and there will no longer be a filibuster for Supreme Court nominees. That seems like the most likely sequence there.
Do you want to game out the list? Dianne Sykes, Bill Pryor?
Yeah, I think it's actually fairly likely that he is going to pick one of these appellate judges. He's had meetings with a smaller number of people, members of that list that he initially put out during the primary, and then after he was won the nomination. I would anticipate it is going to be somebody like Dianne Sykes or Bill Pryor, as opposed to maybe a member of the Senate. And I think as soon as that pick is made, to Ryan's point, everybody goes back to their foxholes, and you just see this kind of partisan loyalty. You'll have some initial sort of pushback against it, but unless there's some scandal associated with the nominee or something along those lines, instead, I think you would see a situation where the judicial filibuster goes away and they're on the Supreme Court.
Carol, the next question was, could the Republicans get to 60 seats in the Senate in 2 years, or could the Dems take back the Senate in 2 years? And if they did, would they just refuse to confirm anyone that Trump nominated during the second 2 years?
That would be a long time. What is it? It's eight or nine seats that are up in the midterms. I mean, that's possible. I think it really depends. If you look at when Barack Obama came in 2009, he had all the momentum. He was hugely popular, far more popular than polls currently show that Donald Trump is. And he had a massive agenda for just his first year alone. But he got bogged down in healthcare, and that did him in. And the midterms in 2010 were a disaster for him. So I think it really depends on how Trump navigates and Congress navigates the first year and for the first 18 months. And we don't know how that'll go, but taking on healthcare, the track record is not very good for a president facing midterm elections.
Can I just add one thing? Once a norm is broken, one side complains about the other side breaking the norm. Once it's broken, the other side adopts it without respect to their previous arguments, right? So the Republicans complained a lot when Reid got rid of the filibuster for nominees, right? They're not going to think twice about getting rid of it for Supreme Court. The Democrats thought it was appalling when McConnell refused to even give a hearing to Barack Obama's his Supreme Court nominee. Democrats, if they, in some miracle, have come out of the midterm elections with the majority in the Senate, they're not going to think twice about making the very same argument. Oh, well, we need a presidential election to decide this seat. And that's the danger of breaking norms like that.
Yeah. Paul, we have two questions. I am a member of the active duty military. As the Commander-in-Chief, what policies do you foresee will have the biggest impact on the lives of U.S. military members? Not really related, but I'm interested in your thoughts on both. We'll put them on the table. Will Donald Trump be impeached in the first 100 days? Either over conflicts of interest, collaboration with the Russians, or his temperament? You can pick one or two.
Well, I think I'll take both and deal with them very, very superficially or briefly. But I sort of get back at another question about who's going to be the Supreme Court nominee. It'll be either Sykes or the lady from Wisconsin or Pryor from Alabama. The problem with Pryor, though, is he has really angered the religious right. Because if you remember, he was the one who ruled against Judge Moore in Alabama and helped remove him from his position because of Moore's insistence on having a monument to the Ten Commandments. And Pryor has been sort of like backing away from that position because he's afraid of losing support on the right. But I wouldn't be surprised if the religious right were to campaign against him. On the question, do I think Trump will be impeached in the first 100 days? Is that a joke, or am I supposed to respond to that? No, I don't think it's going to happen. Although I have a neighbor who was a Bernie Sanders supporter who came to my house yesterday and told me it was inevitable that he would be impeached or assassinated within the first 100 days.
Well, no talk of that. But to the degree that it's not a joke, what would a scenario that would lead to impeachment be?
I was literally about to ask you guys that. What would it take for a Republican Congress, a Republican House of Representatives, to initiate impeachment proceedings? It would be what you would expect. Very, very clear evidence of a high crime or misdemeanor. Very clear corruption. And I'm not saying this is true. I'm just throwing out something that would lead to that. Imagine Trump received several $1 millions from a foreign government to fund his campaign. I suppose then you'd get the interesting question, well, he wasn't president when that happened, it doesn't matter. But it would just have to be very, very clear wrongdoing with no ambiguity, where Republicans could not mount a defense of the activity.
Well, that's
the emoluments clause, which I feel like I'm obsessed with this issue that nobody really seems to care about. I don't think that's going to do it. There are a lot of scholars that now think he'll be in violation of the emoluments clause of the Constitution when he's sworn in. I think there's enough of a argument on the other side to prevent that from leading to impeachment. It has to be very clear evidence of wrongdoing. And I think liberals, I think are I've heard this argument, the same argument said, he won't make it past the first term. He's going to be impeached. Right. Something's going to happen to him. I wouldn't count on that.
I want you to beat on the emoluments clause, because Ryan wrote this great piece on the arguments that Trump has violated the foreign emoluments clause, and I was so thrilled that he quoted the experts on the emoluments clause from the thrilling Interactive Constitution, which you can find in the App Store, and which unite Zephyr Teachout and Ben Tillman, to the two leading conservative experts on the emoluments clause, to debate where they agree and disagree. Check it out.
Just to the first question about active duty military. And I had this question quite a lot at Thanksgiving because I have 4 different family members who are all active duty military. I actually think the biggest impact that Trump is going to have is actually not so much in terms of the change in the temperature at the Pentagon or some of the other changes that are going to happen. But I actually think it's going to be the issue of tackling the VA, where he's made a decision to kind of stay the course and name someone who was in a key role currently in trying to fix the VA, which was a little surprising. A lot of names have been thrown out for that position who were true outsiders, who had never worked in a situation like this before. That's a huge challenge. That's an enormous technocratic challenge, and it's one that Trump returned to repeatedly in his speeches as an example of a government failing to work for its citizens in the way that he wants. I actually think that's a promise he absolutely needs to deliver on within the first term.
That was a fascinating pick. It just seems so un-Trump-like.
Yes,
he's not even a veteran, I believe.
No,
which is which is somewhat unusual to run the VA.
One thing, just from people who are inside, have told me is that he does have good relationships with the various groups, the veterans groups that are out there, which has always been a critical barrier to getting the kind of reforms in place that Republicans have traditionally wanted.
And he's apparently very well respected inside the VA, and people who were terrified of Trump's pick are very happy with this person.
We're almost out of time, and it is unconstitutional for Constitution Center panels to run over. But Carol, as we begin to sum up, do you expect to see a constitutional crisis early in the Trump administration, and what might it look like?
I don't know. Do you guys? I can't think of. I know. I mean, what we're going to see. I'm thinking more in like the next week because I have to go to work, and we'll start to see real motion on Monday when he starts to roll back and undo a lot of executive actions. But I don't know.
Paul, I think last word to you. With your deep historical perspective, do you expect a constitutional crisis during the Trump administration, and what might it look like?
I would agree with Carol. I don't think it's like, I think what's more likely is he may have trouble governing effectively unless he changes his style. At some point, he's going to have to win the confidence of a majority of people sitting in the United States Congress. I think these are problems he's going to have to confront. But I really don't see a constitutional crisis in the next 4 years.
So exciting, ladies and gentlemen, to have such a civil, meaty, wonky discussion at the beginning of the Trump administration. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Very, very good. I like your enthusiasm.
Gotta keep up the laugh.
I have no idea.